Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku trained under Moon Knight, learning to balance justice and madness. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The wind on the rooftop was a liar. It whispered of freedom, of flight, of the endless, aching blue of the sky. It tugged at the lapels of his black kakurin, a playful phantom trying to lift him from the suffocating gravity of the world. But Izuku Midoriya knew the truth. There was no flight for him. There was only the concrete, the chain-link fence biting into his palms, and the long, long way down. All Might's words were not a whisper. They were a physical weight, a tombstone carved with two devastating phrases that had settled upon his shoulders and crushed the very marrow in his bones. Be realistic. You cannot be a hero. He had chased the sun his entire life, his eyes fixed on the brilliant, smiling radiance of the symbol of peace. He'd filled notebooks, 14 of them now, with frantic scribbles, detailed analyses, and hopeful theories, each page a prayer to a dream he believed was his birthright. He'd endured the sneers, the explosions from Kaken's palms, the pitying looks from teachers, and the label that had defined him since he was 4 years old, quirkless. Useless. Deku. And he had borne it all because All Might existed. If a man could smile while saving 100 people from a collapsing building, if he could punch through evil with a laugh that boomed like thunder, then the world had to be a place where dreams were worth fighting for. But the sun had shown him its dark side. On this rooftop, the brilliant star had collapsed into a black hole of pragmatism. The skeletal, steaming form of Toshinori Yagi was a truth more brutal than any villain's punch. A hero's body breaks. A hero's power fades. A hero's work is a meat grinder that had chewed up the strongest man alive and was ready to spit him out. And in that grinder there was no place for a fragile, quirkless boy. It's not bad to dream, young man. All Might had said, his voice raspy but not unkind. That was the worst part. It wasn't malice that had killed him, it was pity. Just make sure your dreams are attainable, realistic. Izuku's fingers tightened on his notebook, the one All Might had signed just an hour ago. The ink felt like acid. He'd almost gotten them both killed. He clung to All Might's leg, a desperate parasite, and forced the man to reveal his secret. He had wasted the hero's precious time while the sludge villain, the very monster he'd inadvertently freed, was now loose in the city. The guilt was a physical nausea, churning in his stomach alongside the cold, dead weight of his dream. He finally let go of the fence. His legs were numb, moving on an autopilot programmed for one destination, home. The journey was a blur of hostile color and sound. The vibrant advertisements for hero merchandise mocked him from towering digital billboards. The cheerful jingle of an Endeavor-themed energy drink commercial felt like a personal insult. The city pulsed with the power he would never have, a constant, celebratory roar that he was now irrevocably outside of. He was a ghost haunting the edges of a festival he was not invited to. When he arrived at the small, unassuming apartment that had always been his sanctuary, it felt like a crypt. The smell of his favorite food, katsudon, hung in the air, a testament to a mother's love that he felt he no longer deserved. Izuku! Welcome home! Inko Midoriya bustled out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her smile was a fragile, hopeful thing. I saw the news with the sludge villain. I was so worried, but All Might saved the day, as always. I'm making your favorite to celebrate. To celebrate what? His spectacular, public failure? The final, definitive nail in the coffin of his life's ambition? He couldn't meet her eyes. He mumbled a greeting, toeing off his shoes with a lethargy that felt bone deep. He dropped his yellow backpack to the floor with a heavy thud. Izuku? Is everything all right? Her voice was soft, laced with the ever-present worry that had defined her motherhood. He stood in the hallway, the All Might poster on his bedroom door staring at him with its ridiculous, unyielding smile. He couldn't do it. He couldn't go in there. He couldn't face the pantheon of heroes lining his shelves, their plastic eyes judging his failure. He turned back to his mother. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? The number one hero told me I was useless today, Mom. The man you always told me to look up to just pushed me off a cliff. Instead, he did the only thing he could. He replayed the scene that had haunted him for a decade. He pointed a trembling finger at the computer screen in the living room, where an old video was paused. A younger, healthier All Might saving dozens of people, his laughter echoing. Inko's face fell. She knew that video. She knew the question that always followed. Mom! His voice cracked, a raw, wounded sound. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were dark, swirling pools of a pain so immense it stole her breath. Can I still be a hero? It was the same question he'd asked as a 4-year-old, his body trembling, tears streaming down his face after the doctor's devastating diagnosis. But this was different. This wasn't the hopeful plea of a child. This was the ragged gasp of a drowning man. Inko's own eyes welled with tears. She rushed forward and wrapped him in a hug, her small body trembling. Oh, Izuku! I'm sorry! I'm so sorry! The words hammered into him. She was sorry. She wasn't saying yes. She wasn't offering false hope. She was apologizing for his brokenness, for the dream she knew he could never have. It was confirmation, from the one person whose belief had always been his last bastion. The dam inside him didn't just break, it atomized. A choked, guttural sob ripped from his throat, and he clung to her, the smell of katsudan and his mother's love mingling with the stench of his own failure. He cried until his throat was raw and his eyes were swollen, until the hollow space in his chest was a raw, aching void. He didn't eat the katsudan. He couldn't. He excused himself, mumbling something about homework, and locked himself in his room. But the room was a prison of judgment. The Silver Age All Might figurine on his desk seemed to glower, its smile a cruel rictus. He tore it from its stand and hurled it against the wall, where it shattered into a dozen plastic pieces. The sound was unsatisfying. It did nothing to silence the screaming in his own head. He had to get out. He slipped out of the apartment without a word, pulling the hood of his gray sweatshirt over his head. The sun had long since set, and the vibrant, hero-worshipping facade of Muzurifu was giving way to its grittier, nocturnal reality. The main streets were still bright, full of people heading to restaurants and karaoke bars, but Izuku found himself drawn to the dimmer, narrower side streets. He walked without purpose, his feet carrying him away from the familiar and into the forgotten. The character of the city changed with every block. The clean, polished storefronts gave way to shuttered businesses with faded signs and graffiti-laced walls. The cheerful chatter of civilians was replaced by the low rumble of souped-up engines and the distant, mournful wail of a siren. The air grew thick with the smell of overflowing dumpsters, stale beer, and the metallic tang of urban decay. He was in a part of the city he'd only ever seen on news reports about villain arrests. The Kamino Ward's outer edges, a place where the shadows were deeper and the light of hero society didn't quite reach. He should have been scared. A quirkless boy in a place like this was a target, a piece of meat. But the fear was a distant emotion, muffled by the thick, suffocating blanket of his despair. What more could they take from him? His wallet? His life? It all felt trivial. His soul had already been stolen on that rooftop. He watched from the shadows as a deal went down in an alley, a small, twitchy man exchanging a briefcase for a wad of cash with a hulking figure whose skin seemed to be made of rough, gray stone. No hero swooped in. No police patrol turned the corner. The transaction finished, and the figures melted back into the night. It was a part of the world that operated on its own rules, a world that didn't care about All Might's smile. For the first time, Izuku saw the cracks in the system he had worshipped. He'd spent his life analyzing heroes, but he'd never once analyzed where they weren't. His aimless wandering took him deeper, into a labyrinth of narrow alleys slick with grime and God knows what else. The neon signs of seedy bars and pachinko parlors cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to ride like living things. He was a ghost, utterly invisible. No one looked at him twice. He was just another piece of urban detritus, and in a strange way, the anonymity was a comfort. Here, his quirklessness didn't matter. Here, everyone was just trying to survive the night. It was in the deepest, most claustrophobic of these alleys that he heard it. Not the distant siren or the muffled bass from a club, but something sharp, immediate, and ugly. Just give us the wallet, old man. And the watch. Don't be a hero. The voice was a low, guttural sneer. Izuku froze, pressing himself against the cold, damp brick wall. He peered around the edge of a large, overflowing dumpster. The scene was horribly cliché, torn from a dozen safety pamphlets. 3 men, thuggish and reeking of cheap alcohol, had cornered a fourth. The one who spoke had fingertips that elongated into crude, rusty-looking blades. A second, a lanky man with a nervous energy, kept spitting small globs of a sizzling, acidic-looking substance onto the ground. The third was big and brutish, cracking his knuckles with a dull, menacing rhythm. Their victim, however, was not what Izuku expected. He wasn't cowering. He wasn't pleading. He stood with an unnerving stillness, a figure of stark contrast to the grimy alley. He was dressed in clothes of an almost impossibly pure, pristine white, a tailored suit, a waistcoat, and gloves. Even in the gloom, the fabric seemed to catch and hold what little light there was. His back was to Izuku, but the man's posture was ramrod straight, radiating an aura not of fear, but of profound, simmering patience. "I believe," the man in white said, his voice a calm, cultured baritone that cut through the alley's filth, "that you have mistaken me for someone who negotiates." The leader with the blade fingers laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Oh, a tough guy, eh? Look, fancy suit, we're not asking." He lunged. Izuku's breath hitched. His ingrained, useless hero instinct screamed at him to do something. Yell, throw a rock, call the police. But his body was frozen, a prisoner of both fear and a morbid, transfixed curiosity. He needn't have worried. The attack was over before it began. The man in white didn't dodge. He moved with a liquid economy that was utterly mesmerizing. As the blade fingers sliced through the air, he took a half step inside the arc of the swing, his left hand shooting out to grip the thug's wrist. There was a sharp, wet crack that echoed off the brick walls, a sound of bone giving way. The thug screamed, a high, piercing shriek of agony. The man in white didn't release him. He used the man's own momentum, pivoting and slamming him face first into the brick wall. The thud was sickeningly final. The thug slid to the ground, unconscious. It took less than a second. The other two were stunned into inaction for a heartbeat, their bravado evaporating into raw shock. The lanky one recovered first, panic in his eyes. He opened his mouth and spat a glob of acid. This time, the man in white moved with explosive speed. He sidestepped the projectile, which hissed as it struck the wall behind him, eating a hole in the brick. In the same motion, his hand dipped inside his jacket and came out with something that glinted in the faint light, a small, white, crescent-shaped piece of metal. He threw it with a flick of his wrist. It wasn't aimed to kill. It was aimed with surgical, terrifying precision. The crescent dart embedded itself in the lanky thug's shoulder, right in the nexus of muscle and nerve. His arm went limp, the ability to aim his quirk gone. He howled and clutched at the wound, stumbling back. Now it was just a big one. The brute, seeing his friends dispatched with such brutal efficiency, chose flight over fight. He turned to run, but he didn't get 2 steps. The man in white was on him like a phantom, a blur of white against the darkness. He didn't punch. He didn't kick. He moved in close, striking with the heel of his palm at the back of the brute's knee. The leg buckled with another sickening crunch. As the man fell, the white-suited figure drove a gloved fist into the side of his neck, a precise nerve strike that dropped the giant like a sack of stones. Silence. The entire confrontation had lasted maybe 5 seconds. The alley was quiet again, save for the pained groans of the 2 conscious thugs and the dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere above. The man in white stood over them, his chest rising and falling with a steady, controlled rhythm. He hadn't broken a sweat. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit, the movement calm and deliberate. Then, he did something that chilled Izuku to his very core. He reached down and rolled the blade-fingered thug over. The man was still out cold. The figure in white looked at the man's broken wrist, then at his face. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper that Izuku could barely hear. "Tell your master that the moon is rising in this city. Tell him his servants will find no shelter here. Only pain." He then stood up, turning his back on the wreckage of the 3 men. And his head slowly, deliberately, turned towards the dumpster where Izuku was hiding. Izuku's blood ran cold. He was seen. He was caught. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He expected a shout, a threat, another display of terrifying violence. But the man just stood there, his face obscured by the deep shadows of the alley. For a long, silent moment he simply watched. Izuku, paralyzed, could do nothing but stare back. And in that moment, he saw what the man was seeing. Not just a scared kid. The man's gaze seemed to pierce through his flesh, through his fear, and see the raw, gaping wound in his soul. He saw the shattered dream, the endless well of desperation, the suicidal devotion to an ideal that had rejected him. It was a look of profound, unnerving recognition. Then, as silently as he'd fought, the man in white turned and began to walk away, melting into the deeper darkness at the far end of the alley, his white suit a fleeting, ghostly afterimage. Izuku was left alone with the groaning criminals and the stench of his own terror. His mind was a whirlwind. That wasn't heroism. All Might saved people with a smile, his victories clean and uplifting. That was punishment. It was brutal, efficient, and utterly devoid of light. It was ugly and terrifying, and it was the most effective thing he had ever seen. His analytical mind, his one and only asset, was already whirring, replaying the fight. The economy of motion. The use of the environment. The psychological intimidation. The precise, non-lethal but maximally debilitating strikes. His notebooks were filled with analyses of heroes who fought villains. He had never considered analyzing how to simply break a man. He should have run. He should have called the police and scurried back to his empty room and his shattered dreams. That was the safe, sane thing to do. That was what Deku, the useless, quirkless boy, would do. But as he stood there, trembling in the filth of the alley, a new and terrifying thought took root in the barren soil of his despair. All Might said I couldn't be a hero. He never said I couldn't do that. He was about to take a step, to turn back towards the relative safety of the lit streets, when it happened. It was not a sound. It was a presence. A voice that did not enter his ears but bloomed in the center of his skull, a pressure that was ancient and immense. It was cold, so cold, like the void between stars. It was heavy, like the weight of a stone sarcophagus. It felt like moonlight given sound, vast and utterly indifferent to human concepts of good and evil. The world broke you, child, Izuku gasped, stumbling back, his hands flying to his head. He looked around wildly. The alley was empty, save for him and the moaning thugs. There was no one there. It told you that you were worthless. It snuffed out your sun and left you in the dark. The voice was a deep, resonant whisper that vibrated through his very being. It wasn't angry. It was stating a fact, as simple and as absolute as gravity. I am the god of the lost and the broken. I am the protector of those who travel at night. I am vengeance. Tears began to stream down Izuku's face again, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of sheer, overwhelming awe and terror. He was going insane. The trauma of the day had finally snapped his mind. That had to be it. That man you saw is my fist. My knight. He understands that some worms only fear being crushed. He brings my justice to this land of false heroes and smiling idols. The voice seemed to focus on him, its cold immensity turning from a general presence to a sharp, penetrating point. I see the fire in your soul, little one. A fire they tried to extinguish. A devotion they threw away. You have the heart of a true believer, with no God to pray to. Izuku fell to his knees on the grimy pavement, his body trembling uncontrollably. His sobs were silent now, his breath catching in his throat. Everything All Might had said, everything his mother's tears had confirmed, was true. He was nothing. He had nothing left. The world broke you, child. The voice repeated, a silken, terrible promise. I can give you the strength to break it back. An offer, where All Might had offered only a realistic, soul-crushing end, this entity was offering a beginning. A dark, terrifying, and monstrous beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. It was power, not the borrowed light of a dying sun, but the cold, sharp-edged power of the moon itself. It was a path. Not the bright, celebrated path of a hero, but a dark, hidden trail of vengeance. He had nothing left to lose. His dream was dead. His future was a flat, gray wasteland. His soul was an empty house. What was one more ghost? What was his sanity compared to the chance to finally have the strength he had begged the universe for his entire life? With a strangled cry that was half despair and half furious, desperate hope, Izuku scrambled to his feet. His eyes, red-rimmed and wild, locked on to the far end of the alley where the white figure had disappeared. He ran. He didn't know who or what he was chasing. He didn't know if he was running towards salvation or damnation. He only knew that for the first time since he'd stood on that rooftop, he was moving towards something, instead of just away. He sprinted through the labyrinth of night, his worn-out red sneakers slapping against the wet pavement, following the ghost of a man in white, called onward by the voice of a mad, rising moon. The chase was a frantic, desperate scrabble through a city that had become an alien landscape. Izuku's lungs burned, each gasp of air a searing pain, but he didn't slow. The ghost in white moved with an impossible, predatory grace, not quite running but flowing through the urban decay. He vaulted over chain-link fences, slid across the hoods of derelict cars, and disappeared into shadows only to re-emerge 30 feet away, a beacon of impossible purity in the grime. Izuku was no athlete. He was clumsy, graceless, and fueled by nothing but a raw, self-destructive desperation. He tripped, he scraped his hands raw on brick walls, he stumbled over discarded trash, but his eyes never left the fleeting white suit. He was following the only glimmer of possibility in a world that had gone completely dark. The chase ended abruptly. Izuku rounded a corner into a wide, deserted square, the dead heart of a forgotten industrial district. In the center of the square stood a derelict Shinto shrine, its wooden structure weathered gray, its paper lanterns long since rotted away. It was a place of forgotten gods, left to crumble in the shadow of the city's modern pantheon of heroes. The man in white was waiting for him there, standing before the silent, empty sanctuary. He was perfectly still, his hands in his pockets, the faint moonlight catching the stark white of his suit. Izuku skidded to a halt, panting, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. He doubled over, hands on his knees, trying to drag air into his protesting lungs. "You're persistent," the man said. His voice was the same calm baritone from the alley, but here in the open, it held a weary weight. "You should have gone home, kid." Izuku straightened up, his chest heaving. He met the man's gaze, though he couldn't make out his features clearly in the gloom. "You..." "The voice," he gasped out. It said you could give me strength." The man was silent for a long moment. He took a step forward, and for the first time, Izuku could see his face. It was a handsome face, but deeply tired, etched with lines of pain and exhaustion that had nothing to do with age. Dark, intelligent eyes assessed him with a frightening intensity. There was a small, faded scar that bisected his left eyebrow. "The voice says a lot of things," the man said, his tone flat. "Most of them are bullshit. His name is Khonshu. And he's a manipulative, narcissistic parasite who gets off on violence." He gestured dismissively toward the sky. "He's also the one keeping me alive and giving me what I need to do my work. It's a complicated relationship." Izuku stared, baffled by the casual, almost bitter way the man spoke of the entity that had just shaken his reality to its foundations. "He called you his fist? His knight? Titles? He loves titles," the man grunted. He finally closed the distance between them, stopping a few feet away. "My name is Mark Spector. And I am not a hero. What I do is dirty, it's ugly, and it breaks people. It breaks me. It's not a dream for a bright-eyed kid to chase." The mention of his dream was like a physical blow. Izuku flinched, but the despair that had fueled his chase now hardened into resolve. "My dream is dead," he said, his voice raw but steady. "The #1 hero in the world looked me in the eye today and told me it was impossible. He told me to be realistic. This..." Izuku gestured vaguely, encompassing the dark alley, the brutal fight, the phantom voice. "This is all I have left." Mark studied him, his gaze unblinking. He saw the tear tracks on the boy's grimy face, the desperate sincerity in his eyes. He saw the same shattered quality he recognized in himself, the look of a man pushed so far past the edge that the only way forward was down. "He is perfect, Mark." Khonshu's voice boomed in both their minds, though only Mark flinched visibly, a slight tick in his jaw. His vessel is empty. Ready to be filled, his faith is a blade without a hand to wield it. Take him. Mark ignored the voice, his focus entirely on Izuku. You have no idea what you're asking for. This isn't about putting on a costume and saving cats from trees. This is about finding the worst people in the world and making them hurt. It's about becoming a monster to fight other monsters. It will cost you everything: your friends, your family, your peace of mind, your sanity. Are you ready for that? Was he? The question hung in the air, heavy and final. He thought of his mother's worried face, the katsudon growing cold on the table. He thought of Kaken's sneer, of All Might's pity. He thought of the 14 notebooks filled with useless analysis, the relics of a dead faith. Sanity? Peace of mind? What good had they done him? Yes, Izuku said, the single word cutting through the night with absolute certainty. I don't care what it costs. Mark let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair. Khonshu wants you. He sees potential. I see a kid on the verge of throwing his life away. He paused, looking from Izuku to the dilapidated shrine, a wry, humorless smile touching his lips. But then, I did the same thing at his age, in front of a broken statue in the desert. He finally looked back at Izuku, his expression hardening into something impossibly grim. All right, kid. You want to be my god's new favorite toy? Fine, but don't come crying to me when you break. The training starts now. Your old life, the one where you were Izuku Midoriya, the hopeful Famba. It ended the moment you ran down that alley. The next few weeks were a descent into a private, personalized hell. Mark's base of operations was not a high-tech cave or a gleaming skyscraper. It was the cavernous, echoing shell of a defunct steel foundry on the industrial outskirts of the city. The air tasted permanently of rust, cold metal, and sweat. This was their school, their church, and their torture chamber. The first lesson was pain. Get up, Mark ordered. Izuku spat a glob of blood and saliva onto the concrete floor. His whole body was a symphony of agony. His ribs felt bruised, his lip was split, and a deep, throbbing ache had settled into his left shoulder where Mark had thrown him for the 7th time. He pushed himself up onto trembling arms, his muscles screaming in protest. You're thinking about the pain, Mark said, circling him like a shark. He wasn't wearing his white suit now. He was in simple gray sweats and a black tank top, his body a map of taut muscle and pale, crisscrossing scars. Pain is just information. Your body is telling you it's damaged. Acknowledge the information, then discard it. It's not useful right now. I can't. Izuku gasped, his vision swimming. Yes, you can. Mark's voice was flat, devoid of sympathy. The villains you'll face won't stop because you're hurt. They'll see your pain and it'll make them more excited. You have to wall it off, put it in a box and lock it away. Fight until the job is done. You can fall apart later. Again, he lunged. Izuku tried to bring his arms up to block, but he was too slow, too tired. Mark's foot swept his legs out from under him, and he crashed to the ground again, his head smacking against the concrete with a sickening thud. Stars exploded behind his eyes. That's lesson 1, Mark said, standing over him. Lesson 2, all that hero nonsense you've studied? Throw it out. Heroes brawl. They posture. They yell the names of their super moves. It's a performance for the cameras. We don't perform. We end fights. This was the core of his physical training. Mark wasn't teaching him a formal martial art. He was teaching him a brutal system of combat designed for one purpose: incapacitation. It was a vicious fusion of Krav Maga's ruthless efficiency, Systema's fluid, bone-breaking counters, and the dirty, desperate tricks of a back-alley brawler. He drilled Izuku relentlessly. How to break a wrist grip. How to dislocate a shoulder with a single, sharp twist. How to use an opponent's momentum against them. He taught him where to strike for maximum effect: the temple, the throat, the side of the knee, the floating ribs, the brachial plexus. These weren't the flashy, powerful punches of All Might. They were small, precise, ugly movements designed to cripple and disable. For weeks, Izuku was little more than a living punching bag. He'd go home at dawn, his body a canvas of fresh bruises, and collapse into his bed, claiming he joined a late-night fitness club. His mother, seeing his exhaustion and the grim determination in his eyes, didn't question it. She just made sure he had food and clean bandages, her heart aching with a silent, unspoken worry. His room, once a shrine to heroes, began to change. The All Might posters came down first, leaving pale rectangles on the wallpaper. The figurines were swept into a box and shoved into the back of his closet. In their place, his notebooks remained open on his desk, but their contents were transforming. This was the other side of his training, the part that happened when his body was too broken to continue the physical drills. It was during these sessions that Izuku began to notice the shifts in Mark. "History is a weapon, Izuku," Mark said one evening, his voice softer, his posture less rigid. He was sitting across from Izuku at a large metal table, surrounded by stacks of books he'd procured from God knows where. His accent had subtly changed, a faint, almost transatlantic lilt creeping in. This was what he called Stephen's time. "You analyze heroes, their quirks, their win-loss records," he continued, tapping a thick tome on Japanese criminology. "It's surface level. It's fan but trivia. To hunt a monster, you need to understand the swamp it lives in. Who funds the Yakuza? What are the historical grievances between rival gangs in the Chiyoda Ward? Which politician is taking kickbacks to ignore the trigger drug trade? This is the battlefield. The villains are just soldiers." Under Stephen's tutelage, Izuku's world expanded. He devoured books on sociology, forensic science, urban planning, and political history. His meticulous, obsessive nature, once dedicated to hero worship, was now repurposed. He started a new notebook, number 15. But this one was different. He would open it to a page on the hero endeavor. His old notes would have been about his flash-fire fist and hell-flame quirk. Now, he erased them. Subject, endeavor, Enji Todoroki. Quirk, hell-flame. High-output pyrokinesis. Tactical weaknesses, overheats with prolonged use, requires cooldown. Close-quarters combat is his preference, predictable lunging patterns. Limited collateral damage control, exploitable. Psychological profile, narcissistic, obsessive desire for one spot. Reports of spousal abuse, clear signs of forcing his ambitions on his children. Highly volatile. Easily provoked through insults to his status. A blunt instrument, not a strategist. Public approval is his armor. Damage that, and you damage him. He did this for every major hero and known villain he could find data on. His beautiful, colored pencil drawings of costumes were replaced with stark, anatomical sketches highlighting weak points and nerve clusters. Patrol routes were mapped out not for a chance to see a hero, but to identify blind spots in the city's security. His notebooks were no longer love letters to a dream. They were becoming tactical manuals for a war. Then there were the lessons from Jake. For these, Mark would take him out into the city's grimy underbelly. His entire demeanor would shift again. His posture became a slight slouch, his gaze constantly moving, scanning crowds, doorways, reflections in windows. His voice became rougher, peppered with street slang. "You stick out like a sore thumb, kid," Jake grumbled one night as they sat in a noisy, smoke-filled pachinko parlor. "You walk like you're scared. You look like you're trying to memorize everything. You look like a cop or a tourist. You need to look like you belong. You need to be no one." The lesson was about invisibility. How to walk with a purpose that suggested you were from the neighborhood. How to sit in a bar and nurse a single drink for 2 hours, listening to the conversations around you. How to pick up on the subtle cues of the criminal underworld, the hand signals, the coded phrases, the unspoken rules of territory. Izuku failed miserably at first. He was too earnest, too polite. He drew attention by trying not to draw attention. Mark, Jake, would drill him, forcing him to walk through crowded markets, to order food from seedy street vendors, to sit in dive bars until he learned to shed the skin of a nervous high school student and wear the cloak of urban anonymity. "Information is the blood of this city," Jake explained, his voice low. "And it flows through the people nobody notices. The taxi drivers, the bartenders, the homeless. They see everything. You want to know what a villain is planning? You don't hack his computer. You buy a beer for the janitor who cleans his office. Slowly, painfully, the pieces started to come together. The physical brutality from Mark, the intellectual rigor from Stephen, the street-level cunning from Jake. Izuku was being unmade and remade, forged into something new in the crucible of the foundry. His body grew leaner, harder, a network of wiry muscle covering a lattice of healing bones. His eyes lost their wide, innocent awe, replaced by a sharp, analytical focus that missed nothing. He learned to compartmentalize, to consciously channel the lessons he was being taught. When I need to fight, I think like Mark. When I need to plan, I think like Stephen. When I need to listen, I think like Jake. It was his way of coping, of creating a system to manage the fracturing of his old self. And always, in the quiet moments, in the dead of night when he was alone, there was Khonshu. The voice in his head was a constant companion, a low, lunar hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. It would offer praise when he landed a particularly brutal strike in training, a sibilant whisper of approval when he uncovered a piece of damning information. Good, child. The fist must be hard. The mind must be sharp. You are learning. You will be my greatest avatar. Izuku learned to live with the voice, to treat it as a background noise, a condition of his new existence. But he never forgot that it was the source of all this, the mad god at the center of his new universe. After 2 months of this relentless, soul-crushing training, Mark decided it was time for the final exam. They were perched on a rooftop overlooking a moderately busy street, the city lights painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. The foundry was silent tonight. The training was over. Now came the test. Down there, Mark said, his voice back to its usual tired rasp. He pointed to a narrow alley across the street. Local gang, the Skulls. Low-level trash. They've been preying on people leaving that train station for weeks. Police don't care. Heroes are too busy with giant robot attacks. It's your move. Izuku's heart began to pound, a frantic drum against his ribs. He looked down into the alley. He could see 2 figures lurking in the shadows, their silhouettes menacing. As he watched, a young woman in an office uniform walked past the alley's mouth, her pace quickening as she clutched her purse. The 2 figures tensed, ready to move. This was it. Not a drill. Not a sparring session against Mark. Real people. Real stakes. What do I do? Izuku asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mark's expression was unreadable in the dark. That's up to you. You can walk away. Go home. Forget any of this ever happened. Or you can go down there and deliver some of that justice you've always been crying out for. He paused, his gaze intense. But if you go all the way. No half measures. No hesitation. You end it. Understood? Izuku's mouth was dry. He swallowed, the sound loud in his own ears. He watched as a new potential victim appeared, a young man, probably a university student, distracted by his phone. The 2 thugs in the alley shifted, their target selected. This was the moment of choice. The final step off the cliff. He could still turn back. He could cling to the tattered remnants of the boy he used to be, the one who dreamed of smiling heroes and clean victories. Or he could embrace what he had become. He thought of the pain, the bruises, the endless nights of study. He thought of the cold, hard logic of Stephen and the ruthless efficiency of Mark. He thought of the promise Khonshu had made, strength to break the world back. He turned to Mark, his face set in a grim mask of determination. Understood. He didn't use the fire escape. He used the path Mark would have taken. He dropped silently onto the balcony of the floor below, then to a dumpster, his movements economical and quiet, his body remembering the endless drills. He slipped into the alley from the opposite end, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. The 2 thugs had cornered the student. One, a wiry man with a crowbar, was sneering. The other, broader and taller, was reaching for the student's backpack. The student was pale, his hands raised in surrender. Izuku's mind went unnervingly calm. The frantic drumming of his heart faded, replaced by a cold, steady beat. The lessons took over. Analyze. The voice of Stephen was a clear thought in his mind. 2 hostiles. One with a melee weapon, crowbar. Range, 1 meter. Second hostile is larger, likely relies on brute strength. Victim is panicked but unharmed. Environment is narrow, walls on both sides. No escape route for them. He moved. He didn't shout a heroic challenge. He didn't announce his presence. He closed the distance in 3 silent, rapid steps. The wiry one with the crowbar heard something at the last second and started to turn. It was too late. Fist. The mind of Mark took the reins. Izuku's left hand shot out and clamped down on the man's wrist, twisting sharply, a move he had practiced 500 times. There was a sickening pop as the wrist dislocated, and the crowbar clattered to the ground. The man screamed, but the sound was cut short as Izuku's right palm struck him precisely on the chin, snapping his head back against the brick wall. The man crumpled out cold. The second, larger thug stared in shock for a precious half-second, his brain failing to process the sudden, violent turn of events. He roared and charged, his fists raised. Predictable, the cold part of Izuku's mind noted. All rage. Izuku didn't try to meet the charge head-on. He sidestepped, letting the man's momentum carry him past. As he did, he drove the heel of his shoe hard into the back of the thug's knee. The joint buckled with a wet tearing sound, and the man howled in agony, his charge turning into a stumbling fall. Izuku didn't give him time to recover. He brought his clasped hands down like an axe on the back of the man's neck. The thug collapsed onto his face, groaning once before falling still. Silence. The entire fight had taken less than 4 seconds. The university student was staring at him, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He looked from the 2 motionless bodies to Izuku, who was standing in the center of the alley, his chest rising and falling. Izuku looked down at his own hands. They were steady. They weren't bruised. They weren't broken. They were weapons. A wave of something hot and dizzying washed over him. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't joy. It was a terrifying, exhilarating rush of pure, unadulterated power. He had done it. He had faced violence, and he had not only survived, he had dominated. He had imposed his will on the world. Then, the adrenaline began to recede. He looked, really looked, at what he had done. The man with the dislocated wrist was moaning, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. The larger man was unconscious, a trickle of blood leaking from his nose. The sheer, brutal finality of it hit him. These weren't training dummies. They were men. He had broken them. A tremor started in his hands. It spread up his arms to his shoulders, until his whole body was shaking. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. The calm, cold mind of the fighter was gone, replaced by the horrified conscience of Izuku Midoriya. He felt a wave of nausea. He stumbled to the alley wall and retched, the meager contents of his stomach spattering on the grimy bricks. He had wanted this. He had begged for this. And now that he had it, he was terrified of what it meant. The student, finally snapping out of his shock, stammered a thank you, grabbed his backpack, and fled the alley as if hell itself was on his heels. Izuku was left alone with the wreckage he had created. He slid down the wall, his legs no longer able to support him, his body still racked with tremors. He was horrified. He was disgusted with himself, and yet, deep beneath the horror, the exhilaration remained, a dark, glowing ember in the pit of his stomach. A sense of terrifying satisfaction. He had delivered justice. It was bloody, it was ugly, but it was real. Mark's specter appeared at the mouth of the alley, his face an impassive mask. He looked at the 2 downed thugs, then at the trembling, horrified boy who had taken them apart. You hesitated, Mark said, his voice cutting through Izuku's daze. After you dropped the second one. You stood there for a full second. In a real fight, that second gets you killed. Izuku looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. I broke them. That was the job, Mark said simply. He walked over and nudged the larger thug with his foot. He'll have a concussion and a torn ACL. The other one has a dislocated wrist and a new respect for dark alleys. They'll live. They'll also think twice before they do this again. That's more than any hero would have done for this neighborhood tonight. He looked down at Izuku, and for the first time, there was something other than weary pragmatism in his eyes. It wasn't approval. It was recognition, the look a master craftsman gives a tool that has proven its worth. You pass, Mark said. As Mark's words settled in, The voice of the moon god echoed in the hollow space of Izuku's soul, a sound of immense, chilling pride. Yes. You did. The first blow has been struck. Vengeance has been served. This is only the beginning, my fist. My beautiful, broken child. Izuku Midoriya sat in the filth and the dark, the blood of strangers on the pavement near his feet. He was shaking. He was horrified. He was powerful. And he was utterly, irrevocably lost. He had been forged. The days that followed the alley fight were a study in fractured reality. By day, Izuku Midoriya was a ghost haunting the halls of Aldera Junior High. He sat at his desk, his back ramrod straight, a posture drilled into him by Mark. He no longer flinched when Bakugo's explosions popped off nearby, merely tracking the motion with cold, analytical eyes that made his former tormentor deeply uncomfortable. The other students, who had once treated him with a mixture of pity and contempt, now just gave him a wide berth. There was a stillness to him, a coiled tension beneath his skin that was more unnerving than any quirk-fueled outburst. He was a predator forced to sit in a cage full of chattering monkeys, and the strain of it was immense. His nights were a different world. He continued his training with Mark, but it had shifted. The lessons became more refined, more specialized. They spent hours on rooftops, practicing stealth and movement, learning to read the city's nocturnal rhythms. Steven's lessons delved deeper into criminal psychology and forensic analysis, turning Izuku's notebooks into frighteningly accurate predictive models of criminal behavior. Jake's lessons involved quiet, tense trips to the edges of the underworld, where Izuku learned to listen, to blend, to become a part of the scenery. And sometimes, Mark would give him a target. A low-level drug dealer operating near a school. A lone shark known for breaking fingers. Izuku became a phantom rumor in the city's underbelly, a whisper of a pale, swift-moving ghost who left behind broken bones and terrified criminals. He never killed. Mark was adamant about that line, a strange, hypocritical morality that Izuku didn't fully understand but clung to desperately. But his justice was brutal. He became an instrument of pain, and each time, the ritual was the same, the cold, analytical stalk, the swift, explosive violence, and the gut-wrenching, shaking aftermath where the horrified boy from Mizurufu wrestled with the efficient monster he was becoming. The duality was tearing him apart. He would come home, the phantom pain of a dislocated shoulder echoing in a thug's scream, and have to sit down to dinner with his mother, who would ask him about his day. He'd lie, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, telling her about school, about the fitness club, all while the voice of Khonshu hummed in his skull, a low, constant thrum of approval for the night's work. Their fear feeds you, child. Their pain is a prayer. You are my will made manifest. Shut up. Izuku would whisper into his pillow at night, the words a desperate, futile plea. One afternoon, everything changed. Izuku was walking home, his mind 1,000 miles away, replaying a training scenario where he'd failed to disarm Mark quickly enough, when the world erupted in chaos. An explosion rocked the street a few blocks ahead, followed by panicked screaming. Plumes of black smoke billowed into the sky. Instinct, both old and new, took over. The old Izuku, the hero fanboy, would have run towards the danger out of pure, selfless instinct. The new Izuku, the one forged in the foundry, also moved towards it, but with a different purpose. His pace quickened, his eyes scanning, analyzing. He melted into the growing crowd of onlookers, his hood pulled up, his body language shifting into the anonymous slouch Jake had taught him. He was no longer a civilian. He was an observer, gathering intelligence. He wormed his way to the front of the crowd, his stomach twisting into a cold knot when he saw the source of the chaos. It was the sludge villain, the same one from that morning, the one All Might had captured, the one he had caused to escape by clinging to the hero's leg. Guilt, sharp and piercing, stabbed through him. This was his fault. The scene was a disaster. The narrow shopping street was on fire. Pro-heroes were on the scene. The wooden Kamui Woods was busy evacuating civilians. The brawny Death Arms was trying to punch through the sludge with no effect, and the rescue hero Backdraft was struggling to contain the spreading flames. They were doing their jobs, but they were failing. The villain had a hostage. And then Izuku saw who it was. The hostage was thrashing, buried up to his neck in the swirling, viscous green slime. Wild blonde hair, furious red eyes, and the sound of muffled explosions popping uselessly within the sludge. Kaken, a complex, ugly cocktail of emotions flooded Izuku. He saw his childhood friend, his lifelong bully, the boy who had branded him Deku, suffocating. A part of him, the dark, cold part that Mark had nurtured, whispered, "He's getting what he deserves. He's all rage. Predictable. Easy to break." He crushed the thought with a surge of horror. No. That was conscious logic. That was Mark's brutal calculus. He was still Izuku Midoriya. And Kaken, for all his cruelty, was still a person. He was dying. He watched the heroes, his mind shifting into Steven's analytical mode. Kamui Woods, useless against a liquid opponent. Death Arms, brute force is ineffective, his punches pass right through. Backdraft, occupied with containment. The villain is amorphous, but its eyes and teeth appear to be solid matter. That's a weakness. A vulnerability. The heroes were talking, shouting. "I can't get a grip on him. Damn it, if I just had a little more power!" They were waiting for someone with the right quirk. They were following protocol, and while they waited, Bakugo was suffocating. His struggles were weakening, the explosions becoming smaller, more frantic. Izuku looked at the scene, his new instincts screaming at him. The heroes were treating it like a set-piece battle, a problem to be solved with the right tool. They weren't seeing the immediate, tactical reality. This isn't a fight. It's a rescue. And the objective is to create an opening, the voice of his training echoed. He saw All Might in the crowd, in his skeletal form, clutching his side in agony, his face a mask of self-loathing. He was out of time. He couldn't transform. He was helpless. Just like Izuku used to be. Then, the sludge villain's gaze swept the crowd and landed on Izuku. A flicker of recognition. "You!" It gurgled, its voice thick and wet. "The little gnat from this morning! This is all your fault!" The villain was distracted. Bakugo's eyes, for a single, desperate second, met Izuku's. And in them, Izuku didn't see fury. He saw terror. Pure, undiluted, mortal fear. That was it. The breaking point. He didn't know why he moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a compulsion that bypassed every logical thought, every ounce of training. It was the old Izuku, the one who ran into danger because it was the right thing to do, surging forward. But his body didn't move like the old Izuku. He didn't just run blindly. As he burst from the crowd, his eyes scanned the debris-strewn ground. He saw a chunk of shattered concrete, about the size of a brick. Without breaking stride, he scooped it up. His arm cocked back, not with the wild, desperate energy of a fanboy, but with the coiled, precise tension of a trained fighter. "Kid! No! Stop!" Death Arms yelled. Izuku ignored him. He wasn't aiming for the villain's main body. He was aiming for the single, solid weak point he had identified. He threw. The chunk of concrete flew through the air, spinning, a crude but effective projectile. It struck the sludge villain directly in its large, grotesque right eye. Splat. The impact wasn't powerful enough to do real damage, but it was shocking. The villain reeled back with a gurgling roar of pain and surprise. Its gelatinous form spasmed, its grip on Bakugo loosening for a fraction of a second. It was the opening. That single, tactical act was all it took to shame the man watching from the crowd. All Might, seeing the quirkless boy he had dismissed do something more effective than any of the pros on the scene, felt a surge of adrenaline and defiance. Pathetic. He thought at himself. I am pathetic. He forced his broken body to act, the embers of one for all flaring into a desperate inferno. Detroit Smash! He roared, his body transforming mid-stride into the colossal symbol of peace. The punch didn't even connect. The sheer air pressure was enough. The shockwave tore the sludge villain apart, splattering it across the street. The wind pressure was so immense it caused the clouds to part, and a sudden downpour began, extinguishing the fires. Silence, then the roar of the crowd. Izuku was on his hands and knees, panting, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He had been knocked back by the blast, but he was unharmed. He looked up to see All Might, standing tall, his fists raised to the sky, a triumphant smile on his face for the cameras. But All Might wasn't looking at the cameras. He was looking at Izuku, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. His eyes held a look of profound shock, confusion, and something else Izuku couldn't quite decipher. Later, after the pros had praised Bakugo for his tenacity, and berated Izuku for his recklessness, Izuku was walking home, his mind a maelstrom. The guilt over causing the incident warred with the cold satisfaction of his successful analysis. He had been right. He had created the opening. He hadn't needed a quirk. He had needed a plan. A fine display, child. Concha's voice purred in his head. You saw the weakness. You exploited it. You acted while the so-called heroes dithered. This is the path. My path. Izuku gritted his teeth, shoving his hands in his pockets. He hated that the mad god was right. DKU! He flinched, turning to see Bakugo stomping towards him, his face a thunderous scowl. I didn't need you to save me! Bakugo snarled, getting right in his face. I had it handled. You didn't do anything. You're still a quirkless, useless nobody. Don't you ever look down on me again. Got it? He shoved past Izuku and stormed off. But Izuku had seen it. Behind the rage, behind the bluster, he had seen the same flicker of fear from the alley. And he realized something profound. Kaken wasn't angry because Izuku was weak. He was angry because for a single, terrifying moment, he hadn't been. As Izuku stood there, processing this, a new figure appeared, jogging up to him. I am here! All Might, back in his heroic form, skidded to a halt in front of him, striking a pose. Hey All Might! What are you doing here? Izuku stammered, his old fanboy instincts warring with his new, cynical worldview. Young man! I have come to thank you, and to revise something I said earlier. All Might declared, steam beginning to wisp from his body. He glanced around. But not here. He grabbed Izuku's shoulder and, with a powerful leap, they were airborne. They landed on a deserted stretch of beach, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery colors. All Might deflated with a hiss of steam, shrinking back into the skeletal form of Tashinori Yagi. He coughed, a speck of blood appearing on his lips. Kid, he said, his voice raspy and serious. Today, I saw something. The pros on the scene, myself included, we were paralyzed. We were waiting for the right tool for the job, but you saw something different. You're quirkless, you had no power to bring to that fight. But you acted. You analyzed the situation, you saw a weakness, and you created an opportunity. That wasn't recklessness. That was tactical. It was heroic. He looked Izuku dead in the eye, his gaze burning with a new intensity. I told you on that rooftop that you couldn't be a hero. I was wrong. I was projecting my own limitations, my own brokenness onto you. What I saw today, that's the spirit of a true hero. The instinct to save, backed by the will to act. Young man, you too can become a hero. Izuku stared, his heart a confused, fluttering mess. These were the words he had longed to hear his entire life. The validation he had craved, the permission to dream. But now, hearing them, they felt hollow. They felt late. The greatest heroes all have stories about their school days. All Might continued, a strange, passionate fire in his eyes. Most of their stories have one thing in common. Their bodies moved before they had a chance to think. He smiled, a genuine, tired smile. That's what happened to you today, wasn't it? Izuku's mouth went dry. His body moved before he could think. Yes, that was true. But it had moved with Mark's training. He had acted on Steven's analysis. He had thrown that rock with the precision he had learned from hours of practice with crescent darts. It wasn't just selflessness. It was skill. A dark, brutal skill. So I have come to you with an offer. All Might said, his voice dropping. My quirk, it is not something I was born with. It is a sacred torch, passed down from one generation to the next. He held up a hand, a faint, warm energy beginning to glow around it. Its name is One for All. It is a stockpiling quirk, a power cultivated for the sole purpose of defeating evil, and I have deemed you worthy of inheriting it. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Izuku stared at the glowing hand, then at All Might's earnest, hopeful face. One for all. A quirk. Not just any quirk, but the quirk. The power of the symbol of peace himself. It was everything he had ever wanted, handed to him on a silver platter. It was the sun, reaching down to pull him out of the darkness, and in his head, the moon screamed. No! The voice of Khonshu was not a whisper this time. It was a psychic roar of pure, possessive fury. It was the sound of a jealous god seeing his chosen acolyte being tempted by a rival faith. This is a trick. A false light. He abandoned you. He called you worthless. I am your patron. My power is real, earned through pain and sacrifice. His is a handout, a charity for the weak. The force of the psychic assault was so strong Izuku staggered, clutching his head. Pain, cold and sharp, lanced through his skull. Young man? Are you all right? All Might asked, his face etched with concern. Izuku gasped for air, his vision swimming. The two immense forces were at war inside him. One for all felt like a warm sun, a promise of hope, of smiles, of a world where people could be saved without being broken. Khonshu's blessing was a cold moon, a power of vengeance, of punishment, of a world where evil was met with equal and opposite brutality. The sun offered redemption. The moon offered strength. He looked at All Might's hopeful face. This was a chance to be the hero he'd always dreamed of being. A real hero. A hero who could save people with a smile. It was a chance to wash the grime of the alleys off his soul, to silence the whispers of the moon god forever. But could he? Could he just forget the lessons? Could he forget the cold, hard truths Mark had taught him? That some people don't deserve mercy? That some fights can only be won with brutal efficiency? The world wasn't as simple as All Might's smile. He had seen its ugly, dark corners. He had walked in them. He had become one of their denizens, and a terrifying thought occurred to him. What if he didn't have to choose? What if he could have both, the sun and the moon? Light and dark. Hope and vengeance. One was a shield. The other was a sword. A hero needed both, didn't they? To save the innocent, but also to punish the guilty. To be a symbol of hope, but also a figure of fear to those who preyed on the weak. He could be the hero All Might wanted him to be. But he would be a hero armed with the terrible knowledge Khonshu had given him. He could wield the power of the sun, but he would not be blinded by its light. The decision solidified in his mind, a moment of terrible, momentous clarity. He would walk two paths at once. He would bear the weight of two immense, contradictory powers. It would be agony. It might drive him mad. But it was the only way forward. He straightened up, his eyes meeting All Might's. The pain in his head subsided as Khonshu's roar faded to a low, sullen, hateful silence. The god was listening, waiting for his answer. All Might, Izuku said, his voice trembling but firm. You offer me the chance to be a hero. To save people. That's all I've ever wanted. A slow, relieved smile spread across Tashinori's face. I accept. The first taste of one for all was like swallowing the sun. They stood on the shores of Dagoba Municipal Beach Park, a man-made disaster zone that had become a monument to illegal dumping. Mountains of rusted appliances, broken furniture, and discarded technology formed a jagged, artificial mountain range against the backdrop of the rising sun. It was here, amidst the filth and decay, that All Might, Tashinori Yagi, laid out his plan. My quirk, one for all, is a tremendous power, Tashinori explained, his voice serious as he gestured to the mountains of trash. An unprepared vessel would be torn apart by it. Your limbs would explode from your body. Izuku paled, but the clinical part of his mind, the part honed by Mark, simply filed it away. High-output kinetic energy. Requires extreme physical conditioning to handle the backlash. Therefore, Tashinori declared, striking a pose that was comical on his skeletal frame. You must forge your body into a worthy vessel. And you will do it by cleaning this entire beach. This will be your training, my boy. A heroic act of community service that will also build you into the hero you are destined to be. Izuku looked from the skeletal man to the seemingly endless sea of junk. It was an impossible task. But the old, earnest part of him, the part that had dreamed of this moment, flared to life. It was a challenge from All Might himself. He would not fail. Yes, sir, he said, his voice filled with a genuine, unfamiliar enthusiasm. The next day, Toshinori brought the final ingredient for the transfer. He plucked a single hair from his head. "No," he said, holding it out to Izuku with the reverence of a holy relic. "Eat this," Izuku stared. Ha! The transfer of One for All was, to put it mildly, an anticlimax. The hair went down with a gulp of water, tasting of nothing. For a moment, Izuku felt nothing. He flexed his hands, waiting for a surge of power, a lightning bolt from the heavens. There was only the sound of the waves and the cawing of gulls. Then it began. It wasn't a physical sensation at first. It was a feeling, a presence settling into the hollow spaces within him. It was warm, like the first rays of sun after a long, cold night. It was a hum of latent energy, a feeling of boundless, optimistic potential. It felt like every heroic ideal he had ever held, condensed into a single point of light that began to glow in his sternum. It felt like hope, and the darkness within him recoiled. Conscious presence, which had become a low, constant hum in the back of his mind, reacted to the infusion of One for All like a vampire to holy water. A shriek of psychic agony and rage tore through Izuku's consciousness. "Poison! Filth! He taints you! He burns my mark from your soul!" Izuku cried out and staggered back, clutching his head. The two forces were at war inside him, a metaphysical battle being waged in the territory of his own body. One for All was a rising tide of warm, golden light, seeking to fill every part of him. Conscious power was a cold, jagged shard of obsidian lodged in his soul, refusing to be dislodged. The clash was agonizing. It felt like being torn in two. His vision flickered, alternating between the sun-drenched beach and a terrifying, vivid flash of a moonlit desert, a towering, bird-skulled figure looming over him, its empty sockets radiating pure malice. "Young Midoriya!" Toshinori cried out, rushing to his side. "What is it? Is the transfer too much?" "It's fighting," Izuku gasped, sweat beading on his forehead. He could feel it now, two distinct energies warring for dominance. One for All was a broad, powerful river. Conscious blessing was a venomous serpent swimming against the current. He focused, using the mental discipline Mark had beaten into him. Acknowledge the pain. Discard it. It's not useful. He built the mental walls he'd been taught, compartmentalizing the agony. He forced his breathing to even out. The psychic screaming subsided, but the internal conflict remained, a deep, unsettling vibration that resonated in his bones. He had accepted the sun, but the moon refused to set. The training began in earnest. Toshinori's American Dream Plan was a grueling regimen of strength training, cardio, and diet, all centered around the monumental task of clearing the beach. Every morning before school and every evening after, Izuku was there, hauling, lifting, and dragging, and the war within continued. When he first tried to tap into One for All, the result was a disaster. He focused on the feeling of hope, of boundless power, and tried to pull a rusted refrigerator from a pile of trash. He felt the warm energy surge, and then the cold, venomous power of Concha lashed out, trying to corrupt it. "Shatter it! Do not move it, destroy it! That is true power!" The result was an uncontrolled, chaotic burst of energy. The refrigerator didn't move, it exploded. Green lightning, crackling and wild, arced from Izuku's arm, mixed with a faint, sickly silver luminescence that seemed to drink the light around it. The fridge was torn to shreds, shrapnel flying in every direction. Izuku was thrown backward, his arm screaming in agony, feeling as though it had been both supercharged and frostbitten at the same time. Toshinori stared, his jaw slack. "My word! The sheer output, but the control!" Izuku cradled his arm, his teeth gritted against the pain. It was more than a lack of control. It was a conflict of intent. One for All wanted to move. Concha wanted to destroy, and his body was caught in the middle. This became the pattern of his training. Every attempt to use All Might's power was a battle. He would try to lift a heavy object, and the whispers in his mind would urge him to crush it. He would focus on a controlled burst for a powerful leap, and the cold influence would try to turn it into a bone-shattering pounce. His progress, however, was undeniable, if terrifying. He grew stronger at an alarming rate. The beach began to clear. At first, it was small things, bags of trash, old tires. Then, it was washing machines and couches. Soon, he was hauling cars out of the sand, his muscles screaming under the strain, the dual energies warring beneath his skin. He moved with an unnatural, predatory grace that deeply unsettled his mentor. When he ran, it wasn't the powerful, straightforward stride of a hero. It was the low, ground-eating lope of a hunter. When he lifted, his muscles bunched with a coiled tension that spoke not just of strength, but of contained violence. He was fulfilling the letter of Toshinori's plan, but the spirit was all wrong. "Remarkable, my boy!" Toshinori would say, giving him a thumbs up, trying to inject his signature optimism into the grim proceedings. "Your progress is incredible. You're a natural." But later, when Izuku wasn't looking, Toshinori's smile would fade. He'd look at his successor, this intense, quiet boy who moved like a shadow and whose eyes held the unnerving stillness of an old soldier. He had chosen the boy for his heroic heart, for the selfless light he'd seen in him. But there was a darkness in Midoriya now, a profound and chilling coldness that hadn't been there before. He chalked it up to trauma and a difficult home life, but the feeling of wrongness grew with each passing day. It was like watching a beautiful, powerful engine being fed the wrong kind of fuel. It ran, but with a dangerous, rattling sound that promised an eventual, catastrophic failure. The nights became Izuku's true crucible. Sleep offered no escape. It was simply a different battlefield. His dreams were vivid, terrifying affairs. He would find himself standing in a vast, empty space, a void of gray mist. Before him stood the vestiges of One for All. They were indistinct, shimmering figures of light, 8 of them, their forms blurry and undefined. He could feel their collective will, a sense of purpose, of sacrifice, of a long, unbroken chain of heroism. One of them, a woman with spiky hair whose silhouette felt oddly familiar, radiated a feeling of gentle gravity. Another, a bald man with strange goggles, pulsed with stern resolve. They were a silent council, their presence a warm, comforting weight. But they were not alone. Looming behind them, a colossal shadow that blotted out the imagined stars, was Khonshu. His bird skull head was tilted, his empty sockets fixing on Izuku. He wasn't a vestige. He was an intruder, a hostile deity invading a sacred space. The warm light of the vestiges seemed to bend and warp around his cold, dark form. "They are ghosts, child." Khonshu's voice echoed through the dreamscape, a sound of dry, rustling linen and crumbling stone. "Echoes of the dead. Their power is a faded memory. I am eternal. I am here. Their hope is a fantasy. My vengeance is a certainty." The vestiges would surge forward, their light intensifying, trying to push the dark god back. The bald man would raise a hand, a silent command. The woman with spiky hair would step in front of Izuku, a protective gesture. But they couldn't touch him. Khonshu was not of their world, not of their power. He was a foreign entity, an infection in the system. Izuku would stand between them, torn. The vestiges reached for him with hands of light, offering peace, belonging, a place in their heroic lineage. Khonshu would extend a skeletal claw, offering power, certainty, the cold satisfaction of retribution. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering, the conflicting energies still swirling within him. The warmth of the vestiges felt like a distant, longed for home. The cold certainty of Khonshu felt like the grim, undeniable reality he now inhabited. His relationship with Mark grew more strained. He couldn't tell his first mentor about All Might or One for All. It felt like a betrayal. He started making excuses, cutting his nocturnal training sessions short. "You're distracted," Mark grunted one night, after effortlessly blocking a series of strikes from Izuku in the foundry. "Your head's not in the game." "What is it?" "Nothing. I'm just tired," Izuku lied, panting. Mark's eyes narrowed. He saw the changes in Izuku, the new muscle mass, far more than their training alone could account for, the flicker of green lightning that sometimes sparked in his eyes when he was frustrated. He was no fool. The sun god's power festers in him, Khonshu hissed in Mark's mind. He is being corrupted by hope. You must remind him of the true path. Remind him what real pain feels like. Mark ignored the voice, his own complicated feelings bubbling to the surface. He felt a strange mixture of pride and resentment. This boy he had taken under his wing, this broken kid he was forging into a weapon, was finding another source of power. Another master. It felt like a personal failure. Tired doesn't get you killed. Distracted does, Mark said, his voice cold. He lunged, his movements a blur. He didn't pull his punches. He drove Izuku back with a flurry of brutal, punishing blows, forcing him to rely on his raw, instinctual training. For a few moments, the old dynamic was back, the master breaking down the student. But then, cornered and desperate, Izuku reacted. A surge of one for all, hot and wild, mixed with the cold fury of Khonshu's influence, erupted from him. He threw a punch, not with the precise, targeted efficiency Mark had taught him, but with raw, overwhelming force. The air cracked. Green and silver lightning exploded around his fist. Mark, with his own divinely enhanced senses, felt the sheer power coming off the blow and barely managed to get his arms up in a crossguard. The impact sent him skidding back 10 feet, his arms numb and tingling, a look of genuine shock on his face. Izuku stared at his own fist, which was trembling violently, glowing with a faint, residual light. He hadn't meant to do that. He had lost control. The two of them stood in the silent foundry, the air thick with unspoken truths. Mark knew. He might not have known the name One for All, but he knew Izuku now wielded a power beyond Khonshu's blessing, and he knew it was changing him. Get out, Mark said, his voice quiet and dangerously flat. Go home. Don't come back until you figure out whose soldier you want to be. Izuku fled, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He had been dismissed by his first master, the man who had given him a path when he had none. He was caught between two worlds, and it felt like he was about to be torn apart by both. The 10 months of training passed in a blur of agony, exhaustion, and internal conflict. The beach was cleared. On the final day, Izuku stood atop the last mountain of trash, a towering pile of crushed cars and rusted metal. He was no longer the scrawny, trembling boy who had first come here. His body was lean and powerful, scarred and hardened. The UA entrance exam was the next day. Toshinori stood on the newly pristine beach, tears streaming down his face. Oh my goodness! He roared, his pride and joy overwhelming him. He looked up at the boy who had accomplished the impossible. You did it, young Midoriya! You are a worthy vessel! Izuku looked down at him, his face grim. He had done it. But the cost was immense. He felt like a walking civil war. He couldn't fully grasp the warmth of One for All without the moon's cold venom trying to poison it. He couldn't access the brutal efficiency of Khonshu's blessing without the sun's light trying to purify it. He was a paradox, a fusion of hope and vengeance that satisfied either side. He let out a raw, primal scream, not of triumph, but of pure, unadulterated release. He pushed off the top of the junk pile, a full-throated roar tearing from his lungs. For a single, fleeting moment, he let both powers surge through him without trying to control or separate them. Green lightning and silver shadow erupted around him. He felt the pure, heroic power of One for All course through his limbs, a promise of salvation. Simultaneously, he felt the cold, predatory strength of Khonshu, a promise of retribution. The world seemed to slow down. He could feel the spin of the earth, the pull of the moon, the warmth of the sun on his skin. He was a bridge between two warring gods, a conduit for two opposing forces of nature. Toshinori watched, his jaw agape, as his successor stood there, bathed in an eerie, shifting aura of green and silver, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, dualistic light. This was his boy. His successor, the next symbol of peace. And he looked like a vengeful god. The next morning, standing before the towering gates of UA High School, Izuku felt a strange sense of calm. The war within him was still raging, but he had survived the first major battle. He had contained the storm. He had forged a body strong enough to house two gods, and a mind fractured enough to listen to both. He was no longer just Izuku Midoriya. He was no longer just the fist of Khonshu. He was no longer just the inheritor of One for All. He was something new. Something dangerous. Something unstable. He took a deep breath and walked through the gates. The path ahead was uncertain. But for the first time, he felt ready for it. He was a weapon, sharpened by two masters, aimed at the heart of villainy. And he was about to be unleashed. The auditorium at UA High was vast, dark, and thrumming with nervous energy. Izuku sat wedged between 100 other aspiring heroes, a solitary island of cold calm in a sea of anxious chatter. He recognized Katsuki Bakugo several rows ahead, his spiky blonde hair a familiar point of aggression in the crowd. Bakugo was practically vibrating with arrogant confidence, a stark contrast to Izuku's own coiled stillness. He wasn't nervous. The past 10 months had burned that simple emotion out of him, replacing it with a grim, hyper-aware readiness. This wasn't a test, it was a hunting ground. And he had been trained by the apex predator. The lights flared to life, illuminating a massive stage where the voice hero, Present Mike, stood, his signature grin plastered across his face. "Welcome, one and all, to my live show!" he screamed, the volume making the speakers crackle. "Everybody say hey!" A dead, awkward silence filled the hall. Izuku's lips thinned. He's trying to disarm them with enthusiasm, the analytical part of his mind, the Steven part, noted. Break their tension, make them feel at ease, but it's having the opposite effect. The pressure is too high. It's making them more anxious. Present Mike, undeterred, launched into an explanation of the practical exam. They would be unleashed in a massive, simulated urban environment. Their opponents, a variety of robots, designated as 1-, 2-, and 3-point villains. The goal was to accumulate as many points as possible by disabling them. A boy with glasses and dark, serious hair shot to his feet. Izuku recognized him from the school gates, the same one who had tried to admonish him for mumbling. He began a loud, chopping diatribe about the 4 types of robots listed on the handout, calling out the potential distraction of a 4th, 0-point robot and admonishing Izuku directly for his perceived lack of focus. Izuku didn't even look at him. His eyes were fixed on the schematics of the robots on the giant screen. Joints, sensors, power cores. He was already dissecting them, his mind running tactical scenarios. The 0-pointer was huge, a walking obstacle. Not a target, his inner Mark grunted. An environmental hazard. Use it or avoid it. Don't fight it. As they were herded onto buses and driven to their designated battle centers, the war inside Izuku was a low, simmering hum. One for All was a warm, eager presence in his limbs, a coiled spring of heroic potential. It wanted to leap into glorious combat, to perform feats of incredible strength. Conch's blessing was a cold weight in his gut, a whisper of predatory cunning. It wanted to stalk, to ambush, to dismantle with brutal efficiency. For now, they were in a state of tense equilibrium. He stepped out of the bus into Battle Center B. It was a breathtaking cityscape, a sprawling maze of concrete and glass, perfectly designed for chaos. The other examinees were stretching, boasting, or psyching themselves up. A friendly-looking girl with a round face and pink cheeks was taking deep, calming breaths nearby. Izuku paid them no mind. He was already scanning the rooftops, the alleyways, the potential choke points. He was not here to compete with them. He was here to hunt. He had come prepared. Under his green tracksuit, he wore a prototype of the gear he and Mark had designed. It wasn't a costume. It was equipment. Reinforced gloves with weighted knuckles, lightweight body armor woven with aramid fibers over his torso. And strapped to his thighs, concealed beneath his pants, were 2 slim sheaths. Each held a stack of his new signature tools, crescent darts. Forged from a lightweight carbon steel alloy, they were perfectly balanced, razor-sharp, and non-lethal if used correctly. They were his scalpels. And begin! Present Mick's voice boomed from unseen speakers. The massive gates slid open. The other students stood frozen for a second, confused. What's wrong? The test started! Run! Run! The pack surged forward. Izuku did not. He let them go, a chaotic wave of color and noise rushing past him. He stood at the gate for a 3-second count, his head tilted, listening. He could hear the grinding gears and hydraulic whir of the robots up ahead, the sounds of the first, frantic clashes. Then he moved. He didn't run down the main street. That was a killing jar. He veered left, into a narrow alleyway. He leaped, his legs coiling with a controlled burst of 1 for All, not a city block leveling smash, but a focused, contained push. He shot upward, his gloved fingers finding purchase on a window ledge. He scrambled up the side of the building with a speed and agility that was utterly inhuman, a fusion of a spider and a wraith. From the rooftop, he had a panoramic view. Below, the other students were fighting with flashy, powerful quirks, smashing the one-pointers head-on. It was messy. It was loud. It was inefficient. Izuku's eyes scanned the cityscape, and he saw it. A two-pointer, a sleek, scorpion-like machine, was crawling along the side of a building 2 blocks away, its optical sensors glowing red. It hadn't been engaged yet. Mine, he ran. His movement was a fluid, silent blur across the rooftops. He used small, precise flares of one for all to clear the gaps between buildings, the green lightning crackling around his feet for only an instant. It wasn't the explosive leap of an all-might. It was the calculated pounce of a panther. He landed on the roof across from the two-pointer, dropping into a low crouch. His hand went to his thigh, his fingers closing around the cool, smooth metal of a crescent dart. Analyze. The voice of Stephen was a cool, clear thought. Model 2V, heavily armored chassis. Primary weapon, tail-mounted laser, weak points, optical sensor cluster on the head, and the unarmored hydraulic joint at the base of the tail. He didn't aim for the body. That was a waste of energy. He rose, his arm whipping forward in a practiced, fluid motion. The crescent dart spun through the air, a white sliver against the blue sky. It struck the robot's tail joint with a sharp thunk. The metal wasn't thick enough to stop it. The dart severed a key hydraulic line. Black fluid sprayed out, and the tail slumped, its laser useless. The robot's head swiveled, its main optical sensor fixing on Izuku's position. It let out a metallic screech of aggression. Izuku had already thrown the second dart. It embedded itself dead center in the glowing red camera lens. The sensor shattered with a pop of static. The robot was now blind and disarmed. It began to thrash wildly, a wounded, confused beast. Izuku left it there, already moving, scanning for his next target. 2 points. Clean, quiet, efficient. Back in the observation room, a panel of pro heroes watched the monitors with varying degrees of interest. "That kid with the explosion quirk is racking up points like crazy," commented the R-rated hero, Midnight. "He's a natural powerhouse. The one with the engines in his legs is showing impressive speed and control," said the blood hero, Vlad King. But Nizu, the principal of UA, a small, white-furred creature with the gleam of hyperintelligence in his black eyes, was watching a different screen. He pointed a small paw at a monitor displaying an overhead view of Battle Center B. "And what?" Nizu said, his cheerful tone belying a sharp curiosity. "Do we make of him?" On the screen, Izuku's green-clad figure was a phantom. He was barely visible, a flicker of movement in the periphery. He never engaged in the chaotic brawls on the streets. He was always on the rooftops, in the alleyways, striking from the shadows before melting away again. Aizawa Shoyuda, the hero known as Eraserhead, leaned forward, his tired eyes narrowing. He watched as Izuku, from a perch 3 stories up, dropped a small, weighted object, looked like a piece of rebar he'd picked up, directly onto the head of a 3-point robot, a bipedal machine with heavy armor. The impact stunned the machine for a crucial second. In that instant, Izuku dropped silently from his perch, landing on the robot's shoulders. He drove a crescent dart into the exposed wiring at the nape of its neck, and the machine seized up and collapsed. The whole engagement took less than 5 seconds. "He's not fighting them," Aizawa murmured, his voice a low rasp. "He's assassinating them. His quirk seems to be a simple strength enhancer," Midnight observed, looking at his file. "Midoriya Izuku. Quirk, superpower. The registration is recent. That's not quirk use," Aizawa countered, pointing at the screen. "That's training. Look at his movements. The economy of motion. The target prioritization. He's treating this like a military infiltration, not a hero exam. Where does a middle school kid learn tactics like that?" Nizu's smile widened, his black eyes gleaming with intense interest. "Indeed. Most curious." Izuku had lost count of his points. He didn't care. The hunt was everything. He moved through the city like a ghost, a one-man insurgency against the robot army. He became a master of the ricochet, bouncing darts off walls to strike sensors from impossible angles. He used his environment, kicking loose rubble to create distractions, using smashed windows as new vantage points. He combined the predatory grace of his Moon Knight training with the raw, controlled power of One for All. It was a terrifyingly effective synthesis. He landed in a darkened alley to catch his breath, his heart pounding a steady, powerful rhythm. The dual energies within him were singing, working in concert for the first time. The warmth of One for All provided the power for his impossible acrobatics, while the cold blessing of Khonshu provided the focus, the ruthlessness, the sharp-edged clarity of the hunter. Yes, Khonshu's voice whispered, a sound of profound satisfaction. This is how it should be. The sun provides the fuel, but the moon guides the hand. You are my perfect weapon. For once, Izuku didn't argue. The god was right. This felt correct. It was then that the ground began to shake. A deep, groaning rumble echoed through the city, the sound of something colossal shifting. The other examinees, who had been busy cleaning up the last of the smaller robots, stopped and stared. A shadow fell over the alley. Izuku looked up, and up, and up. The zero-pointer. It was a monster, a skyscraper-sized behemoth of green metal and black plating. It dwarfed the surrounding buildings, its single, massive red eye scanning the cityscape with cold indifference. It wasn't a villain to be fought. It was a force of nature. The other students screamed and ran. It was the logical, correct response. The robot was worth 0 points. Engaging it was pointless and suicidal. Izuku prepared to move, to fade back into the shadows and let the stampede pass. But then he heard a small, pained cry. He glanced back and saw the friendly-faced girl from the entrance. She was trapped, her leg pinned beneath a large slab of concrete, a result of the zero-pointer's emergence. She was directly in the monster's path. Her face was pale with terror and pain as she struggled uselessly against the heavy rock. The other students ran right past her, their own panic eclipsing any heroic instinct. Izuku froze. She is not the mission, the cold, logical part of his mind stated. The mission is to accumulate points, to pass the exam. She is a non-combatant. A liability. Engaging the zero-pointer is inefficient and dangerous. Abort. That was Mark's voice, the voice of the pragmatic soldier. But then, another voice rose up. The warmth of One for All surged in his chest, a feeling not of logic, but of pure, selfless compassion. It was the voice of Tashinori Yagi, of the smiling hero who runs towards danger. A hero saves people. That is the first, and only, mission, and for a terrible, agonizing second, the war within him raged anew. Logic versus instinct. Vengeance versus justice. The moon versus the sun. He looked at the girl's terrified face. He looked at the indifferent, advancing machine of death. He thought of All Might's words, a hero's body moves before they have a chance to think. He made his choice. He burst from the alley, a green blur of motion. He didn't run towards the girl. He ran towards the robot. What is he doing? Midnight shrieked in the observation room, her hands flying to her mouth. Aizawa leaned so far forward he was nearly touching the screen, his eyes wide. Is he insane? Izuku's mind was a whirlwind of frantic calculation. He couldn't smash the robot. Not head-on. Even with One for All, it was too big, too powerful. He would shatter every bone in his body. He needed to disable it. Not destroy it. Disable it. Tactical analysis, Stephen. Now, its size is its weakness, the thought came, sharp and clear. High center of gravity. Bipedal locomotion is inherently unstable. The legs. The joints are the key. But they're too heavily armored for the darts. He needed a way up. Fast. He channeled One for All into his legs, a greater concentration than he had ever attempted before. Green lightning, wild and untamed, exploded around him. He leaped. He didn't just jump. He flew. He shot upwards, a human cannonball aimed at the robot's torso. He landed with a loud clang against its metal chest plate, his reinforced gloves scraping for purchase. He was clinging to the side of a walking skyscraper. The robot's internal systems registered him as a pest. A secondary, smaller laser turret swiveled from its shoulder to target him. Izuku was already moving. He began to scale the massive machine, his movements a desperate, high-speed scramble. He used every protuberance, every seam in the armor, as a handhold. Laser blasts sizzled past him, scoring molten craters in the plating where he had been a split second before. It was a terrifying, vertical dance with death. He was climbing towards the head. He could see the massive, glowing red eye, the size of a small car. The primary optics, the voice of Mark whispered, a memory from his brutal training. Blind your enemy, and you control them. He reached into his thigh sheath, his fingers closing around not one, but 3 crescent darts. He held them between his fingers like a throwing fan. As he climbed, he found a stable handhold, braced himself, and threw. The 3 darts spun through the air, a perfect silver arc. They struck the massive red lens in a tight grouping. Tink! 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 The sound was pathetic against the scale of the machine. The darts didn't penetrate the thick optic armor. They just stuck there. Useless? No. Not useless. He hadn't been trying to break it. He'd been marking a target. He continued his climb, higher and higher, until he was clinging to the robot's chin. He looked down. The ground was terrifyingly far away. He could see the girl, still trapped, looking up at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. He took a deep breath. Now for the hard part. He let go. For a heart-stopping moment, he was in free fall. Then, he angled his body, using his momentum to swing onto the robot's massive, flat-topped head. He landed in a crouch, the wind whipping around him. He was standing on the beast's crown. Below him, embedded in the optic lens, were his 3 crescent darts. He now had a direct, top-down angle on them. He reached into his other sheath and pulled out his last 3 darts. He crouched low, channeling one for all into his arm. This was his one shot. He needed more than just throwing strength. He needed a piledriver. Green lightning enveloped his arm, so bright it was blinding. The power felt like it was going to tear his limb from its socket. He roared, a sound of pure, focused effort, and slammed his hand down. He wasn't throwing the darts. He was punching them. His fist, moving with hypersonic force, struck the cluster of 3 darts he held. They shot downwards like bullets, like miniature railgun projectiles. They struck the 3 darts already embedded in the optic lens. Crack! The sound was like a thunderclap. The combined force was too much. The optic armor, already weakened, shattered. The massive red eye went dark, spiderweb cracks spreading across its surface. The 0-pointer was blind. The giant robot shuddered, its movements becoming erratic. It let out a deafening screech of electronic confusion. It stumbled, its primary sensor destroyed. But it was still moving forward, still a threat. Not enough. Cripple it. Izuku looked down at its legs. From this vantage point, he could see the massive, piston-like joints at the hips, where the legs connected to the torso. They were covered in thick armor plating, but from above, there was a gap. A maintenance access point, probably. A space just wide enough. He had no more darts. He only had his own body. This was it. The moment of truth. The fusion of 2 warring ideologies into one, single, desperate act. The heroic self-sacrifice of All Might, executed with the brutal, tactical precision of Moon Knight. He took a deep breath, focusing the entirety of One for All into his right leg. Not a percentage. Not a controlled burst. Everything. If you do this, you will break. A part of his mind screamed in warning. The job's not done. Another part snarled back. He ran to the edge of the robot's head and leaped off, aiming himself like a missile at the massive hip joint. Green lightning exploded around him, a corona of devastating power. For a single, glorious, terrifying moment, he was the sun and the moon combined. He was a knight of hope, wreathed in the fires of vengeance. He was judgment made manifest. Smash! He screamed, the word torn from the deepest part of his soul. His foot connected with the hip joint. The sound was not a clang. It was a cataclysm. The robot's armor buckled, caved, and tore like wet paper. The internal mechanisms shattered into a million pieces. The leg was severed from the body. The 0-pointer, its balance gone, its leg crippled, let out one final, deafening groan. It tilted slowly at first, then with gathering speed, and crashed to the ground, away from the trapped girl, its colossal weight shaking the entire city block. Silence. In the observation room, the heroes were on their feet, their faces a mixture of stark disbelief and absolute horror. Coffee cups lay shattered on the floor. Aizawa's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Did you see that? Present Mike whispered, his voice for once devoid of its usual energy. Nisa's smile was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, calculating intensity. Oh yes, he said softly. We saw. Izuku was falling. The world was a blur of blue and gray. The power had vanished, leaving behind an agony so profound it was a white, roaring noise in his ears. His right leg was a shattered, mangled ruin, bent at an angle that was sickeningly wrong. His right arm, from the piledriver punch, was broken in at least 3 places. The backlash from 100% was absolute. So this is it, he thought with a strange, detached calm. I saved her. But I'm going to die. He closed his eyes, accepting it, and then he felt a slap. A sharp sting across his cheek. He opened his eyes to see the girl, the one he'd saved. She was right there, falling beside him, her face grim with concentration. She had used her quirk to free herself, and had leaped up to catch him. Release! She cried, touching him with the pads of her fingers. His momentum vanished. The crushing force of gravity disappeared. He was weightless, floating gently a few feet from her. They drifted down together, a slow, graceful descent amidst the dust and debris. They landed softly on the pavement. The moment his feet touched the ground, the pain came back, a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated agony. He collapsed, a choked scream dying in his throat. The girl, Uraraka Ochako, was kneeling beside him, her eyes wide with concern. Are you okay? That was amazing! And terrifying! And, time's up! Present Mick's voice boomed, signaling the end of the exam. Izuku lay on the broken pavement, his body a wreck, staring up at the sky. He had disabled robots. He had saved someone. He had unleashed the full, terrifying power of his dual nature. His point total for villain destruction was respectable. But his rescue points score? It was about to break the system. As Recovery Girl bustled onto the scene, her lips pursed in a mixture of disapproval and grudging admiration, Izuku Midoriya allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction before the pain overwhelmed him and the world went black. He had passed the judgment. He had proven he belonged, and he had shown them all, the heroes, the vestiges, and the dark god in his head, exactly what kind of hero he was going to be.